The sirens were still howling when I arrived. My hands trembled. My knees buckled. My soul gone? They told me not to look. But I did. God, I wish I hadn't. There they were. My wife. My parents. My sister. Burned. Twisted. Still. One crash. 1 second. One drunk driver. For lives. Gone. And me? I was late. Just 5 minutes behind. I should have been with them. I wanted to be with them. I died that day too. Not physically. But everything inside me? Dead. I couldn't cry. Couldn't scream. Only silence. A heavy, choking silence. The funeral was a blur. Too many faces. Too many hands. Too many I'm so sorry s. I didn't want their pity. I wanted my family. I wanted my life back. But you can't rewind a crash. You can't unsay goodbye. I stopped answering calls. Didn't go back to work. Let the dishes rot. Let the fridge go empty. Let myself rot too. Nights were the worst. Every tick of the clock echoed like a heartbeat I no longer had. I slept on the floor beside their photos. Whispered to them in the dark. Begged them to come back. No one came. I stopped eating. Stopped shaving. Stopped being. Friends gave up. Even my dog, Toby, stopped wagging his tail. He knew. I wanted to end it. I thought about it more times than I'll ever admit. Every day felt like walking barefoot through broken glass. But then, a knock. I ignored it. It came again. Harder. Louder. Persistent. When I finally opened the door, he was standing there. A stranger. Bald head. Leather jacket. Smelled like smoke and gasoline. I think this belongs to you, he said, holding Toby by the leash. Apparently, the dog had run off. Found him near Route 11. Almost got hit. I looked down. Toby looked up at me. Eyes full of something I hadn't seen in weeks. Hope. The man squinted at me. You okay, brother? I wanted to slam the door. But I didn't. Something in his voice. It didn't pity me. It understood me. He reached out. Not with words. But with presence. Name's Ray, he said. Looks like you could use a beer. And someone to shut up with. And somehow. I nodded. Ray didn't talk much that first night. And honestly, I didn't either. We sat on my porch, 2 folding chairs creaking beneath us, a 6-pack between our feet. Toby laid across my boots like he used to when the world still made sense. The night was cool, but not cold. The kind of air that stings just enough to remind you you're alive. And for the first time in what felt like a century, I noticed it. I noticed the air. The sky. The sound of crickets in the field across the road. I wasn't okay. I wasn't even close. But I was aware. That was new. Ray lit a cigarette, took a drag, and exhaled with the weariness of a man who'd lived 1,000 lives. He didn't ask about my scars. He didn't prod or press. He just sat there like he'd been doing it for years, like he belonged in that moment with me. I can't explain it. Something about him was calm and broken in the exact same way I was. Not loud about it. Just honest. And I hadn't had honesty in a long time. After a while, he muttered, "You look like a man who's lost everything." I didn't reply. I didn't have to. He nodded like he already knew. Like he was me, just a few years down the line. Me too, he added softly. Wife. Son. Car crash. 6 years ago. That hit me like a punch to the ribs. I turned my head and looked at him for the first time. Really looked at him. And in his eyes I saw the same storm. The same endless ache. It wasn't pity he was offering. It was something far more dangerous. Far more rare. Understanding. He kept coming back after that. Not every day. Not on any schedule. But just enough. Just when I felt like the walls would finally cave in and bury me, he'd show up. Beer in one hand, some greasy food in the other. Sometimes he'd talk. Sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes we'd just drive, windows down, radio low, silence thick. And it was okay. Because I didn't have to pretend with Ray. I didn't have to lie. I could just be a broken man, sitting beside another broken man, both of us held together by nothing more than grief and greasy burgers. I found out he lived in an RV out by the lake. Said he liked it that way. Said it kept him from getting too attached. But somehow he was always there. He helped me fix my porch when the wood started to rot. Helped me clear out the guest room that still smelled like my sister's perfume. He didn't flinch when I cried. Didn't run when I screamed into the empty sky at 2 in the morning. He just stayed. Like a goddamn ghost that refused to leave me alone. And slowly, something started to change. My house stopped feeling like a grave. My mornings stopped tasting like ash. I started taking Toby on longer walks. Started eating real food. Even laughed once when Ray tried to deep fry a frozen burrito and nearly burned down my kitchen. I didn't know it yet, but that man, this rough-edged, gravel-voiced stranger, was becoming something I never thought I'd have again. Family. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't follow rules. It doesn't come in neat little stages like the books say. It comes in waves, violent, unpredictable, and cruel. Some days I could get out of bed and brush my teeth without seeing her ghost in the mirror. Other days I'd collapse in the kitchen because I opened the drawer where she kept the takeout menus. Healing isn't linear. It's a damn maze. But with Ray, I didn't have to hide the mess. He'd sit there while I talked about my wife's laugh or how my dad used to whistle Sinatra songs while changing the oil in his old Chevy. He never interrupted. Never changed the subject. He let me bleed my memories out loud, and somehow that made them hurt less. Made them feel real again. Not like dreams I'd imagined, but pieces of a life I actually lived. One night, we sat by the lake where his RV was parked, and I finally asked him something I'd been afraid to say out loud. How do you live with it? I meant the loss. The pain. The gaping hole that never heals. Ray didn't answer right away. He looked out at the water, cigarette glowing at the tip like a dying star. Then he said, "You don't. You just stop trying to fight it. You let it become part of you." He looked over at me, and his eyes were so damn tired. "And if you're lucky," he added, "you find someone who understands it. Someone who doesn't try to fix you. Just sits in the dark with you." Those words stuck with me. I thought about them constantly. And the more time I spent with Ray, the more I realized he was that someone. The world didn't make sense anymore, but sitting beside him, watching Toby chase fireflies, eating dollar store chips, and talking about nothing, it brought a strange peace. A fragile, imperfect peace, but peace nonetheless. He didn't give me answers. He gave me space. And that was more than anyone else had. Eventually, I started talking about things I hadn't said to anyone. Like how I blamed myself for not being in the car that day. How I kept replaying the moment I got that call over and over as if maybe I could change the ending by remembering it differently. Ray never told me I was wrong. Never told me to let it go. He just said I used to think like that too. And there was power in that. In knowing I wasn't insane. I wasn't weak. I was human. And I wasn't alone. There was one evening, middle of August, when we had one of those conversations that branded itself onto my bones. The sun was setting behind the lake, painting the sky in blood and gold. I was quiet, heavy with thoughts I couldn't name. Ray tossed me a cold beer and said, "You ever think about starting over?" I laughed bitterly. With what? A ghost and a broken dog. He smiled, not mockingly but gently, like he saw something in me I didn't. "With whatever you've got left," he said. "That's how you build again. Not from what you lost, but from what's still standing." That night I didn't cry. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I still hurt. God, I still ached. But there was air in my lungs. My chest didn't feel like it was caving in. And I knew deep down that I was starting to live again. Because of him. Because sometimes a friend doesn't just help you survive. Sometimes they remind you how to live. As weeks turned into months, the world slowly shifted. Not in some grand cinematic way. There was no big breakthrough, no miraculous moment where everything clicked into place. But in the quiet, ordinary seconds, the ones most people miss, I began to notice life inching back into my bones. A sunrise that actually caught my eye. The smell of coffee that made me want to taste it again. The familiar wag of Toby's tail when I walked into the room. It wasn't joy. Not yet. But it was the absence of numbness. And that felt like a miracle. Ray and I started working on my garage one Saturday. It was falling apart, the roof leaking, tools scattered like forgotten memories, everything coated in dust. We didn't talk much that day. Just worked side by side, hands blistered, shirts soaked through with sweat. But there was something comforting in that silence. Something sacred. Like two men quietly rebuilding what the world had shattered, not just with nails and hammers, but with presence, with persistence. We took our time. We didn't rush. Because some things, when broken, need to be put back together slowly. When the garage was finally cleared and organized, we sat on overturned paint buckets, drinking cheap beer and watching the sun sink behind the trees. I turned to him and asked, "Why do you keep showing up?" I didn't mean it like an accusation. I meant it as a real, aching question. I couldn't understand why this man, this weathered soul with a haunted past, kept investing himself in a stranger like me. Ray took a long sip, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Because someone once did the same for me," he said simply. And I didn't think I deserved it either. That answer lodged itself deep in my chest. It sat there like a seed, and over time it started to grow roots. Because it made me realize this friendship, this quiet, stubborn loyalty, it wasn't random. It was intentional. Deliberate. We were both survivors of the same storm, finding shelter in each other when the rest of the world didn't know what to do with our grief. Ray didn't just see me. He recognized me. And that recognition was everything. One rainy afternoon, I invited him inside without hesitation. No apology for the mess. No effort to hide the framed photo of my family still sitting in the hallway like a shrine. He never looked away from it. In fact, he walked over, studied it for a long moment, then nodded once. "They looked happy," he said. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. They were. Ray didn't press for more. He just turned back to me and said, "You made that. You gave them that. That's something no wreck can take away." From then on, he became part of my daily rhythm. We fixed the leaky sink together. He taught me how to fish, though I was terrible at it. I made him watch old movies with me, even the boring black and white ones he pretended to hate. We fought over music, over food, even over the best way to mow a lawn. But beneath all that, there was trust. Unshakable, quiet trust. He knew my darkest days. I knew his. We didn't flinch. I still visited the cemetery. Still brought fresh flowers. Still talked to them, my wife, my parents, my sister, as if they were just in the next room. But I no longer asked them to come back. I no longer begged for a miracle. Instead, I told them about Ray. About the man who'd walked into my shattered life and, piece by piece, reminded me what it meant to breathe. And that was the beginning of something I never thought I'd have again. A reason to stay. It was a Thursday when I realized how much Ray had truly become part of me. Not like a shadow or a habit, but something deeper. Like a heartbeat I hadn't noticed until I thought about what it would feel like to lose it. That day started like any other. We were supposed to meet for breakfast at the diner off Route 9, our spot. Cheap coffee, burnt toast, and a waitress named Darlene who called everyone sweetheart even when she was clearly annoyed. I waited. 10 minutes. Then 20. Then an hour. Nothing. No call. No text. I tried not to panic, but the longer I sat there with that untouched mug in front of me, the more my mind spiraled. Because when you've lost everything once, your brain starts to assume that loss is the only outcome life will ever offer you again. I drove to the lake. His RV was locked up. No sign of him. I knocked. Waited. Called his name. Nothing. That night, I barely slept. Every hour felt like a scream in my chest. I didn't even realize how attached I'd become to his presence until it vanished for 24 hours. It terrified me, the thought of going back to that silence, that emptiness, that void I'd just begun to crawl out of. The next morning, I drove to every damn gas station in town, every diner, every bar we'd ever stepped into together. And finally, at a rundown mechanic's shop on the edge of nowhere, I found him. He was sitting in a plastic chair, grease on his hands, his knuckles raw, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. I didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, staring at him, trying not to fall apart. He looked up at me and muttered, "Sorry. Had to help a buddy pull a busted engine. Phone died. Meant to come back." I didn't yell. Didn't curse. I just sat down beside him and buried my face in my hands. "I thought you were gone," I whispered. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He just put a hand on my shoulder and said, "I know that feeling. And I swear I'll never disappear like that again without telling you." It sounds small, maybe. To anyone else, just a missed breakfast. Just a dead phone. But to me, it was a moment of revelation. Ray wasn't just some man who'd wandered into my life. He was my anchor. My brother. The only person who saw the rubble of who I used to be and decided to sit with me in it instead of walking away. We weren't just two broken men anymore. We were two rebuilt ones. Worn, yes. Scarred, definitely. But standing. That evening, we sat on the tailgate of his truck, sharing a silence that no longer hurt. The sky above us was smeared with the deep oranges and purples of dusk, and Toby lay sprawled between us, snoring softly. I turned to Ray and said, "You know, if I ever make it out of this alive, it's because of you." He didn't respond right away. Then he said, "Nah, man. You pulled yourself out. I just made sure you didn't sink while you did." And in that moment, I believed him. Because true friendship, real, bone-deep friendship, isn't about grand gestures. It's about someone showing up. Again and again. Even when you've got nothing left to give. Especially then. It was strange, the way grief and gratitude started to intertwine. I'd never expected them to live in the same room. But they did. Every memory of my family, every ache that flared up when I passed their old photos or smelled something that reminded me of Sunday dinners, it was always there. The sorrow never left. But neither did Ray. And somehow his presence made the grief quieter. Less like a scream, more like a song in a language only the two of us understood. There was this night, sometime in early fall, when the leaves had just started to turn, and Ray and I sat on the porch wrapped in old flannel blankets, sipping bourbon from chipped mugs. We didn't talk much, but after a while he looked out at the trees and said, "You ever think about what's next?" I hesitated. What do you mean? I mean for you. For this life. You ever see yourself loving someone again? Starting over. The question hit me harder than I expected. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because it scared me. The idea of letting someone in, of risking the kind of loss I'd already endured, it felt like walking through fire barefoot. But I also knew something else. I had survived. And I wasn't surviving alone. That made a difference. I looked at him, his face creased with time and pain and a strange, quiet hope. I don't know, I answered truthfully. But I think, maybe. He nodded, not pushing. Just letting the words land where they needed to. That was Ray. He never shoved, never demanded. He simply offered. Space. Safety. A place to speak without judgment and to stay silent without explanation. He gave me the kind of friendship that asked for nothing but gave everything. And in a world that had taken so much from me, that gift was the most sacred thing I'd ever received. As weeks passed, we started planning small things together. Fixing up the shed. Repainting the living room. Even planting a vegetable garden, though neither of us had any idea what we were doing. We laughed more. Fought over tomatoes versus cucumbers. He always picked the stupidest looking tools from the hardware store just to annoy me. And somehow those tiny, ridiculous arguments became the heartbeat of my new life. A rhythm. A reason to get up in the morning. One night, after working late on the garden, I caught myself staring at the kitchen window. The light was on. The house was warm. Toby lay curled up in his usual corner. And Ray was sitting at the table, scribbling something in a notebook he never let me read. I stood there, in the quiet, and felt something shift inside me. A calmness. A grounding. Not happiness, not yet, but stability. Like I'd finally landed after years of free-falling. Later, as I washed the dirt from my hands and Ray poured us each a glass of bourbon, he said, "You ever think about writing a book?" I laughed genuinely. What the hell would I write about? He smirked. You've got a hell of a story, brother. And people need to hear it. Need to know it's possible to lose everything and still stand back up. That night, long after he left and the house fell silent again, I sat at my desk and opened a blank document. I didn't know where to start. Didn't know what to say. But I stared at that blinking cursor for a long, long time. Because for the first time in forever, I believed I might actually have something worth sharing. And that belief didn't come from a book or a therapist or a miracle. It came from Ray, the man who walked into my life when it was nothing but ashes and stayed. Winter came fast that year. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. The lake froze over, the garden wilted, and the porch we'd fixed together creaked under the weight of snow. But inside, something was different. For the first time since the crash, I didn't dread the change of seasons. Didn't see it as a reminder that life was moving on without them. Instead, I found myself leaning into the rhythm of it, stacking firewood with Ray, letting Toby romp through snowdrifts like a puppy again, sipping coffee that didn't taste like grief anymore. There were still hard days, of course. Days when the silence felt too heavy, when the chair across from me at dinner screamed their names. But Ray was always there. Not trying to fix the ache. Just being in it with me. His friendship had become the warmest thing in that long, bitter winter. There was one particular morning, early January, when the sky was a pale gray and the wind howled against the windows. I'd had a nightmare the night before, one of those vivid, heart-crushing dreams where they were all alive again. We were laughing, eating together like nothing had ever gone wrong. And then, as dreams always do, it turned. The car. The sirens. The fire. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping, the sheets tangled around me like vines. I hadn't had one that vivid in months. I sat in the dark for hours, unable to move, unable to shake the echo of their voices. When the sun finally started to rise, I called him. No words, just a breath. A silence. And that was enough. 20 minutes later, he was at my door, 2 thermoses in hand, snow still in his beard. He didn't ask what happened. Just handed me one and said, "Let's drive." We didn't have a destination. Just took the back roads, letting the snow-covered trees pass us by like ghosts. Eventually, we stopped at this overlook we'd found in the fall. The valley below was blanketed in white, untouched and still. We sat there for a long time, sipping coffee and watching the clouds crawl across the sky. And then I said, "I dreamt of them last night." My voice cracked halfway through, but Ray didn't flinch. He looked at me and said, "That means they're still with you. That kind of love doesn't go away, man. It just changes shape." That broke something in me. Or maybe it healed something. I don't even know. I cried then, hard and unfiltered, the kind of crying that sounds like an animal trying to free itself from a trap. And Ray, he didn't try to stop it. He didn't speak. He just sat beside me, shoulder to shoulder, and let me come undone. In that stillness, I felt the kind of safety I thought I'd lost forever. It was in those moments, raw, unguarded, stripped down to the ugliest truth of who I was, that I realized Ray wasn't just a friend. He was the brother life gave me after it took everything else away. We'd never said it out loud. Never needed to. But the bond we shared wasn't something you could explain. It was forged in fire, tempered by grief, and held together by the quiet, daily choice to show up for each other. That night, back at the house, I printed the first page of that story I'd started writing. Taped it to the fridge. Big, bold letters, I died that day too. Ray saw it, raised an eyebrow, and smirked. Damn right you did. But look at you now. I didn't say anything, just nodded, heart full of something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Pride. Not for surviving, but for allowing someone to pull me back when I didn't even know I was still worth saving. The months that followed were quieter, steadier. Not perfect, nothing ever truly is after a loss like mine, but full of small, significant victories that stitched me back together piece by piece. I started cooking again. Not just frozen meals or instant noodles, but real food. I even dusted off the old family recipe book my mom had given me years before the accident. One night, I made her pot roast. The smell alone nearly broke me. It filled the house with the kind of warmth I thought I'd lost forever. I didn't cry that night, though. I sat across from Ray, watching him devour his third helping, and I laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. The kind that felt like it came from my soul. Damn, he said, mouth full, you could open a diner with this. And for a moment, just a flicker, I believed him. I started writing more too. Not just about the crash or the grief, but about Ray. About friendship. About what it means to be saved by someone who doesn't wear a cape, doesn't say all the right things, but just stays. I'd type late into the night, the words pouring out like I'd been holding them in for years. And maybe I had. Writing was never about closure for me, it was about connection. About reaching through the dark and saying, I'm still here. And if you are too, then maybe we can survive this together. One Sunday morning, we went to the flea market in town. Something I hadn't done since the accident. The place hadn't changed much, same rusty booths, same smell of kettle corn and motor oil, same old guy selling vinyl records that skipped halfway through every song. But walking through those aisles with Ray beside me, I felt different. Present. Whole, even. We found this battered old radio, big, boxy, with peeling paint and a cracked dial. Looks like hell, I said. Ray grinned, holding it up. So do we. But we're still working, aren't we? That radio now sits on my kitchen counter, humming softly every morning while I make coffee. It's a reminder, broken things still have music in them. One evening, as the sky blushed orange and pink, Ray told me he was thinking about moving his RV closer to my place permanently. Tired of driving back and forth, he said, trying to sound casual. But I knew what he meant. He wasn't just sticking around out of habit. He'd made this, us, his home. I swallowed the lump in my throat and said, you know there's a guest room here, right? You don't have to sleep on wheels anymore. He chuckled. You trying to domesticate me? No, I said, smiling. Just saying this place is big enough for two broken bastards. So we did it. We made it official. He parked the RV out back, and little by little it became less of a temporary shelter and more of an extension of home. He brought over his old records, a hideous lava lamp he insisted on keeping, and an ugly armchair that Toby immediately claimed as his own. The house felt full again. Not in the same way it once was. Not with my parents' voices or my sister's music playing down the hall. But in a new way. In a way I never thought possible. It wasn't just about not being alone anymore. It was about choosing each other. About showing up. About building something in the ruins and calling it life. Because sometimes family isn't blood. Sometimes it's someone who walks into your worst moment and decides to stay. And Ray, he stayed. Spring came with an almost surreal gentleness, like the world had decided I'd suffered enough for a while. The snow melted without drama, the trees bloomed in soft pinks and greens, and the air carried that crisp, forgiving scent of beginnings. It had been nearly a year since the crash. A year since the world ended and somehow quietly began again. Ray and I had settled into a rhythm that was so natural it was almost laughable how accidental it all was. We weren't just survivors anymore, we were housemates, brothers, partners in a life we never planned but both desperately needed. One morning, I found him sitting in the garden, sipping his coffee, watching the first sprouts push through the thawed soil. He looked up at me and said, "You ever think they'd be proud of you?" My chest tightened. That question. I'd asked it in my head 1,000 times, but hearing it aloud did something else entirely. I didn't answer right away. I sat next to him, took a long breath, and stared at the fragile green poking through the dirt. I don't know, I finally whispered. But I'm trying to become someone they would have been proud to come home to. Ray nodded slowly. He didn't praise me. Didn't try to comfort me. He just reached out, rested a hand on my shoulder, and gave it the kind of squeeze that said, "You already are." It wasn't until later that night, lying in bed with the windows open and the sound of frogs croaking outside, that I let myself believe him. Grief still visited, of course. Like an old ghost, it would drift through the halls on certain dates, birthdays, anniversaries, quiet Sunday evenings when the air felt too still. But it didn't knock me down like it used to. I'd learned how to sit with it, how to let it pass through me without hollowing me out completely. And Ray was always there, never needing explanations. Just quietly showing up with 2 beers and an open ear. One afternoon, I stumbled across a dusty old photo album in the attic, one I hadn't touched since before the crash. My hands trembled as I opened it. There they were, smiling, alive, frozen in time. My mom's son had tilted too far to one side. My dad's ridiculous Hawaiian shirts. My sister throwing peace signs in every photo. My wife, God, her eyes. I sat on the floor, album in my lap, tears sliding silently down my cheeks. Ray found me like that an hour later. He didn't say a word. Just sat beside me, thumbing through the pages, laughing softly at the terrible fashion choices and ridiculous facial expressions. "They look like they were a lot of fun," he said. "They were," I replied, voice barely above a whisper. "They were my everything." Ray nodded. "Now they're part of you. That never dies." And somehow that gave me peace. Later that week, I started sharing pieces of my writing online. Nothing big, just little essays, thoughts, stories about grief, healing, and friendship. I didn't expect anyone to read them, but they did. And messages started to pour in. From strangers. From people who'd lost everything too. Who saw themselves in my story. Who said, "Thank you for saying what I couldn't." And for the first time since the crash, I felt useful. Not just alive, but purposeful. Like my pain had become a bridge instead of a wall. Ray was the first to call me a writer. "Told you so," he grinned one day as I read him a new post. "You've got more to give than you think." He was right. And every day that I sat down to write, every time I opened up to someone else's hurt, I felt my own begin to soften. Because pain shared is pain divided. And Ray had been dividing mine from the very beginning. The turning point, the real, undeniable shift, came one quiet Thursday evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon and bathe the living room in that golden, almost sacred kind of light. I had just finished reading a letter from a woman in Montana who'd lost her husband and wrote to say my story helped her get out of bed again. I set the letter down, overwhelmed by the weight of it, and turned to Ray, who was sprawled out in that hideous armchair with a glass of scotch resting on his belly. "Can you believe this?" I asked. Me. Helping someone. He didn't even open his eyes. Just muttered, "You think pain makes you useless. But really, it makes you human. People are just waiting for someone to admit they're bleeding so they can stop pretending they aren't." That sat with me long after the sun disappeared. We decided to take a trip not long after that. Nothing extravagant, just a few days in the mountains, somewhere with trails and silence and stars. Ray said it would be good for us. Air that hasn't been corrupted by city trash or emotional baggage, he joked. I packed light. We loaded up the truck with snacks, old rock CDs, and enough beef jerky to feed an army. The drive was long and winding, the kind that makes you feel like the world is unfolding just for you. At some point, we stopped talking. Just let the music fill the space. And it was enough. At the cabin, things were simple. We built fires. Took hikes that left us breathless and aching in the best ways. One night, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, a bottle of whiskey between us, watching meteors streak across the sky like cosmic exclamation points. I turned to him and said, "You know, I thought I'd never feel peace again. But this is close." He didn't reply right away. Just smiled, eyes reflecting the stars. "You found your feet again, brother. That's more than most people can say." The trip changed me. Not dramatically. Not in a way you'd notice right away. But something inside me shifted. I no longer felt like a man haunted by ghosts, I felt like a man accompanied by them. My grief was no longer an anchor dragging me under. It was a scar across my chest, still sore, but no longer open. And every time I looked at Ray, his steady, dependable face, his stupid jokes, the way he always managed to be exactly what I needed without me asking, I felt a gratitude so sharp it bordered on pain. Back home, I started living with intention. I renovated the kitchen, took Toby on longer walks, reached out to a few old friends I'd pushed away in the darkness. I even signed up for a local writers group, showed them some of the pieces I'd shared online. They cried. They thanked me. They understood. And in their eyes, I saw what Ray had been trying to show me all along, that my pain didn't make me lesser. It made me real. Ray and I never talked about the future in big, sweeping ways. We didn't need to. But I started imagining it more often. A quiet life. A shared home. Maybe even a dog for Ray. Toby was getting old, and despite all his protests, Ray had grown attached. One afternoon, I caught him sneaking Toby a piece of steak under the table. "He's old," Ray muttered. "He deserves the good stuff." I didn't say anything. Just smiled and let my heart swell with the unspoken. I still visited the cemetery once a month. Still talked to them. Still brought flowers. But I no longer walked away broken. I walked away full. Because I knew now that loss doesn't mean you stop living. It just means you carry more with you. And I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. I had Ray. My friend. My brother. My family. There was a moment, subtle, almost easy to miss, that marked the day I stopped being a man defined by tragedy and started being a man defined by connection. It happened in the middle of the most mundane task imaginable, fixing the gutter. Spring storms had torn part of it loose, and Ray and I were out there on ladders, cursing under our breath and nearly breaking our necks trying to bolt it back in place. The wind kept knocking our tools off the roof, and at one point Ray shouted, "This house is testing me, I swear." I laughed so hard I nearly fell. But in that laugh, raw, full-bodied, unforced, I realized I hadn't thought about the crash or the grief or the hole in my chest for hours. I was just here, on a ladder, with my best friend, trying to patch up something broken. It felt poetic in a way neither of us needed to say out loud. Afterward, we sat on the back steps drinking lemonade, sweat soaking through our shirts, Toby panting between us. Ray turned to me, squinting into the sunlight, and said, "You ever think about what this would have looked like if we never met?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think about it all the time. And it scares the hell out of me. Because the truth was, without him, I wouldn't be sitting there. I might not be sitting anywhere. I might have drowned in that dark place, swallowed whole by memories and guilt and silence. But instead, I was alive. Fully, undeniably alive. With scars, yes. But also with laughter lines, calloused hands, and a heart that could finally beat without breaking. I remember the first time I introduced Ray to someone as my brother. It was at a barbecue a neighbor threw. We didn't know many people there, just a few names and faces from down the block. But I brought a potato salad and Ray brought a cooler full of beer like we'd been doing it for years. When someone asked if we were related, I said, "Yeah, he's my brother." Ray didn't correct me. He didn't flinch. He just raised his beer, gave me that small, knowing nod, and said, "Damn right I am." We were building something. Something real. Something strong. Not a replacement for the family I lost, that was never the goal. But a continuation of what it meant to be connected. To be seen. To be loved, not with romance or obligation, but with the kind of loyalty that's carved out in fire and forgiveness. The writing took off more than I expected. A publisher reached out about compiling my essays into a book. I nearly deleted the email, convinced it was a scam. But Ray read it, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You have to do this. Not for you. For the people who are still drowning." And so, I said yes. We spent long nights editing, arguing over chapter titles, eating cold pizza while Toby snored at our feet. The book was titled Still Standing, and it was the most terrifying and honest thing I'd ever done. When it launched, I did one interview, just one. I talked about grief. About rebuilding. But mostly, I talked about Ray. About the man who didn't just walk into my broken life, he stayed. And when the host asked if I had any last thoughts, I looked into the camera and said, "Everyone loses someone. But if you're lucky, really lucky, you find someone who makes the loss survivable." For me, that was Ray. He didn't save me with grand gestures. He saved me by being there. Every damn day. After that interview aired, people started reaching out not just to me, but to Ray. They called him a hero, a saint, a symbol of real friendship. He hated every second of it. "I'm no damn saint," he grumbled. "I'm just a guy who knows what hell looks like." But deep down, I think it meant something to him to be seen not just by me, but by the world. To be acknowledged for the quiet strength he gave without ever asking for thanks. And even though he'd never admit it, I knew he was proud. Proud of me. Proud of us. The day the book hit shelves, I didn't do anything fancy. No launch party, no big announcements. Just me, Ray, and Toby sitting on the front porch with a copy between us. It felt heavier than I expected. Not in the physical sense, but in the way it carried every tear, every sleepless night, every hour spent staring at a blank page wondering if anyone would care. Ray flipped through it slowly, pausing here and there, occasionally letting out a grunt of approval or a quiet, "Damn, that's good." But it wasn't until he reached the dedication page that he went still. There, in black and white, were the words, "For Ray, my brother, my lighthouse, the man who reminded me how to live when all I wanted to do was die." He didn't say anything for a long time. Just closed the book, leaned back in his chair, and looked out at the yard like it held all the answers. Eventually, he cleared his throat and muttered, "You didn't have to do that." I smiled. "No. But I meant to." And we sat there, the three of us, in a silence so full it felt holy. No fireworks, no applause. Just the hum of cicadas, the creak of old wood, and the steady, unshakable presence of a friendship that had gone far beyond anything I'd ever known before. Life didn't become perfect after that. Of course not. There were still bad days. Still flashes of grief that hit out of nowhere, a song on the radio, a scent in a store, a laugh that sounded too much like hers. But those moments no longer knocked me off my feet. They passed like storms I'd learned how to stand in. And when the clouds rolled in, I never stood alone. Ray was always there, just like he had been from the very beginning. He never asked for recognition, never needed the spotlight. He just kept showing up like the sun rising every morning, whether or not I was ready to face it. Sometimes we talked about the idea of legacy. What we'd leave behind. I remember one night, after one too many drinks and a long walk under the stars, I asked him, "What do you think people will remember us for?" He shrugged. "Maybe they won't. Maybe it's not about being remembered. Maybe it's just about being known while you're here." That stuck with me. Because that's what he gave me, not a promise of forever, but the assurance of now. The knowledge that I was seen, heard, understood. That I mattered. He never said, "I love you," not in those exact words. That wasn't Ray. But he showed it in 1,000 small ways. In the way he checked the oil in my truck without me asking. In the way he stocked the fridge with my favorite kind of beer even though he hated the taste. In the way he always sat through my long-winded stories about my family without once looking at his phone or checking the clock. And I loved him too fiercely, wordlessly, like you love the air you breathe after nearly drowning. There was a day I'll never forget, an ordinary Tuesday. We were walking through the hardware store, arguing over paint swatches. I wanted a deep blue for the hallway. He called it depression in a can. We laughed so hard the cashier gave us side eyes. On the drive home, with the windows down and the wind in our faces, he said, this is what life's supposed to feel like. Messy. Loud. Real. And I realized then, fully and completely, that I had found not just a friend, not just a brother, but a mirror. Someone who reflected the very best parts of me even when I couldn't see them myself. He didn't erase the pain, didn't replace what I'd lost. But he filled the space beside it with something strong. Something sacred. Something that would never, ever leave. The years didn't rush after that. They unfolded slowly like a novel written in real time. And page by page, I started to see how the story of my life wasn't just about what I'd lost, it was about what I'd built out of the rubble. Ray and I grew older, grayer, a little slower in the knees but still quick with sarcasm and wit. The house evolved with us. New furniture. Fewer shadows. A dog bed that got replaced more times than I could count because Toby was spoiled beyond reason. The photo of my family still hung in the hallway, but it no longer haunted me. It comforted me. It reminded me not of the crash, but of the love that shaped me before it. And that love hadn't ended. It had just changed forms. Ray was family in every way that mattered. He became the one I called when the nightmares returned, when the car wouldn't start, when the world felt too heavy to hold alone. He was the one who stood beside me when I gave a speech at the local community center about loss and recovery. He didn't say a word, just stood there, arms crossed, eyes locked on me like I was the only voice that mattered in the room. Afterward, he clapped once, hard and loud, and said, "You're better at this than I ever was." I smiled, knowing full well I only had the courage to stand there because of him. Our routines became rituals. Mornings spent walking Toby, evenings spent arguing about baseball, weekends filled with projects that never got finished but always gave us something to do. We celebrated holidays together. Birthdays. Even made up our own shitty day recovery night where we'd eat junk food and watch movies that made us laugh until our sides hurt. He became my constant. My compass. The echo in my empty places that reminded me I wasn't empty anymore. And then, one night, unexpected, unfair, unforgiving, he collapsed. It was quick. A heart attack. Sudden and absolute. I rode in the ambulance with him, my hand gripping his the entire time, whispering nonsense, begging, pleading, bargaining with a God I wasn't sure I still believed in. But deep down I knew. I knew. I saw it in the way the EMTs stopped making promises. Heard it in the silence between the beeps. Felt it in the unbearable stillness of the moment his grip went slack. He was gone. Just like that. And the world shifted again. I don't remember much about the hours that followed. People came. People cried. They asked if I was okay and I nodded, but I wasn't. I was fractured. I was ruined. Not the same way as before, this was different. This wasn't a violent ripping like the crash. This was a slow, suffocating pressure like my lungs had decided they'd had enough. I stood at the foot of his hospital bed long after the machines were turned off, staring at the man who had carried me through hell and wondering how the hell I was supposed to keep walking now that he was gone. The funeral was small. Just a handful of people. He didn't have much family, but everyone there knew who he was. Not just what he'd done, but who he'd been to me. I gave the eulogy. My voice cracked more times than I'd like to admit. I said he was the kind of man who didn't try to save you with words, he saved you with presence. With his being. I said he was my brother even though blood never made it official. And I said that I wouldn't be standing there, hell, I wouldn't be standing anywhere if he hadn't knocked on my door that day with my dog in his hands and a six-pack under his arm. I ended with this: Ray didn't just change my life. He gave it back to me. And there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The house was never quieter than it was in the weeks after Ray died. Not even after the accident. Back then I was too far gone to notice the silence. But now? Now I felt it. Every corner, every creak, every unspoken thought echoed louder without him there to share it. His coffee mug stayed on the counter for days. His boots, scuffed, dirt-stained, rested by the door like he might still come in and curse about the weather. I couldn't bring myself to move them. I walked past them every day and let the ache settle deep in my bones. Toby sensed it too. He'd lie by the door for hours, ears perked at every car that passed. Waiting. Hoping. Dogs understand more than we think. But grief, as I'd come to learn, doesn't always knock you down with a scream. Sometimes it's a whisper in the hallway, a laugh you expect but don't hear, a second mug poured out of habit before you remember there's no second set of hands to take it. I stopped writing. Stopped walking. Even stopped opening the curtains. I let myself crumble for a while. And it was okay. Because the man who taught me how to live again had also taught me that falling apart didn't make you weak, it made you real. He would have told me to sit in it. To feel every inch of it. And then, when I was ready, to stand back up. One night, I sat in the garage, the one we fixed together, and pulled out the old notebook he never let me read. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I needed something to tether me back to him. Maybe I was just desperate. I opened the first page, and there it was. His handwriting, all caps, messy and deliberate, notes for the guy who thinks he's alone. My hands trembled. I kept reading. Page after page of thoughts, advice, half-finished sentences. Some of it was deeply personal, about his wife, his son, the guilt he carried like a second skin. But a lot of it was about me. About our friendship. About the hope he saw in my survival. One line stopped me cold. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to be okay. He just needs time. And someone to remind him that even ashes can grow something beautiful. I broke then. Fell forward, forehead pressed against the cold workbench, sobbing so hard it felt like my chest would cave in. But I wasn't just crying for the loss, I was crying for the gift. Because even in death, Ray had managed to reach out and hold me together. It took time, but I started writing again. Slowly. Cautiously. I wrote about Ray. About his gruff wisdom, his terrible taste in music, the way he always had the right words even when he didn't speak them out loud. The pages poured out like rain after a drought. And when I was done, I knew. This wasn't just for me. This was for everyone who ever lost someone who made life bearable. I pitched the idea to my publisher. A second book. A follow-up to Still Standing. I called it The Man Who Stayed. They said yes. The day it hit shelves, I didn't go out. Didn't post about it. I sat on the porch, Toby at my feet, a copy in my lap, and I read the dedication aloud to the empty air for Ray, who stayed when I couldn't. Who loved me when I didn't know how. Who taught me that family isn't blood, it's presence. I miss you, brother. Every damn day. And just like that, the silence wasn't so loud anymore. I began receiving letters again, just like after the first book, but this time they were different. They weren't just about grief. They were about friendship. About connection. About the quiet heroes who walk into shattered lives and choose to stay. People told me stories of best friends who helped them survive divorce, illness, depression. Brothers who weren't brothers by blood, but by bond. One woman wrote, "Your story reminded me to call the person who pulled me off the bathroom floor after my son died. We hadn't spoken in months. I thought I didn't deserve that love. Your book helped me see I still do." I cried reading that. Because it wasn't just about Ray anymore. It was about what he represented. A kind of love this world doesn't celebrate enough, the tough, loyal, quiet kind. I started speaking more publicly, not because I loved being in front of crowds, but because I felt responsible to. Ray would have hated the attention, but he would have been proud of the why. I spoke in libraries, at community centers, even at a prison once. Anywhere they'd have me. I told them about the man who knocked on my door with my dog and stayed long after he could have walked away. I told them how friendship saved my life, not with grand gestures, but with groceries on my porch, silence on my porch, a presence that never asked me to be anything other than broken and trying. It was during one of those talks at a small university in Ohio that a student asked me, if Ray were here right now, what would you say to him? I froze. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because it hit me how long it had been since I'd spoken to him, really spoken. I stepped away from the mic, took a breath, and said quietly, I'd say thank you. For showing up. For not being afraid of my silence. For becoming everything I didn't know I still deserved. The room went still. And in that stillness I felt him. Ray was gone. Physically. But he was in every sentence I wrote. Every step I took. Every man who picked up that book and thought, maybe I can be that kind of friend too. His legacy wasn't a statue or a street name. It was presence. It was impact. It was the simple, undeniable truth that love, when shown without condition, can save a life. I planted a tree for him in the backyard that spring. A maple. Strong. Steady. The kind that could outlive me. I put one of his old dog tags at the base of it, buried beneath the roots, so he'd always have a place in the home he helped rebuild. I'd sit out there sometimes, just me and Toby, watching the leaves dance in the wind, and I'd talk to him. Tell him about my day. Tell him when the damn sink clogged again. Tell him when I missed him so much it hurt. And even though he never answered, I could still feel him. In the breeze. In the rustle. In the silence that didn't hurt anymore. One night, sitting beneath that tree, I whispered, you're still here, Ray. I carry you with me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because it was true. He wasn't a memory. He was a part of me now. The strongest part. The part that knew how to stay. And I would spend the rest of my life honoring that. By showing up. By staying. By being the kind of friend he taught me to be. Time passed as it always does, not asking permission or offering comfort, just moving forward and forward until the pain dulled enough to let the light in again. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. The echoes had softened. The days felt fuller. I started volunteering twice a week at a local shelter, mostly helping with intake and food prep, but also just being there. Because if Ray taught me anything, it was that presence mattered more than perfection. Sometimes I just sit with someone who couldn't stop shaking, or walk a dog that reminded me of Toby in his younger days. I didn't try to fix anyone. I just stayed. And slowly people started to open up. They'd tell me things, secrets, stories, regrets. And I'd listen, not with the intent to respond, but with the same steady silence Ray once offered me. One evening, a man named Curtis, maybe 50, face like leather and eyes that had seen war, sat beside me and asked, you ever lose someone who made everything else make sense? I looked at him, and for a moment I saw myself from years ago. I nodded and replied, yeah. I lost everyone. And then I met someone who helped me find myself again. I told him about Ray. About how one person's consistency, one person's refusal to leave can pull a man from the bottom of the ocean. Curtis listened without blinking, then whispered, I hope I find my Ray someday. I squeezed his shoulder and said, sometimes they don't look the way you expect. But when they show up, you'll know. That night, back home, I sat at my desk and reopened a folder I hadn't touched since finishing The Man Who Stayed. Inside were scraps of ideas, bits of dialogue, pieces of conversations Ray and I had that never made it into print. I read through them slowly, smiling through tears. One line, scribbled in the margin of an old grocery list, caught my eye. It simply read, love isn't what you say. It's what you do when the lights go out. That was him. All the way. A man who showed up when my world went dark and stayed until I found the switch again. I decided then to write one final story, not for publishers, not for interviews, but for myself. I titled it The Porch Years. Just little snapshots of our life together, bad dinners, long drives, stupid fights, quiet mornings. No drama. Just the quiet beauty of ordinary days with someone who mattered more than he ever understood. It wasn't meant to be published. It was just ours. But word got out, as it always seems to. A friend of mine from the writing group asked to read it, then passed it on. Before I knew it, a small press reached out offering to print it as a limited-run memoir. They didn't want to market it as a grief story. They wanted to call it a testament to friendship. I agreed, on one condition: the proceeds would go to mental health programs for men who've lost everything and think they have to go it alone. Because no one should have to go it alone. Ray proved that. At the release event, which I nearly skipped out of fear and stubbornness, I was asked to read an excerpt. I chose a quiet scene. Just me and Ray, sitting on the porch, watching a thunderstorm roll in. No deep conversation. No dramatic moment. Just two men, side by side, drinking coffee, saying nothing, sharing everything. As I finished reading, I looked up and saw a crowd of faces, not just sad, but seen. Not just emotional, but connected. Afterward, a young guy, early 20s, probably came up to me with tears in his eyes and said, "I didn't know men could love each other like that." Like that? I smiled, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "We can. And we should. It might just save your life. Because it saved mine." It's funny how the most ordinary things become sacred when you realize they might be the last. The porch chair Ray always sat in, still there, paint chipped, cushion sunken where his weight once settled, became a monument. Not flashy. Not deliberate. Just real. I couldn't bring myself to fix it. Every time I sat down, I left his spot untouched. It wasn't grief anymore. It was reverence. And maybe that's what love becomes when time strips everything else away, acts of quiet reverence. The tree we planted together had grown tall. Its branches stretched like open arms, the bark rough and strong, leaves whispering every time the wind moved through them. I started hanging little wind chimes from its limbs. Nothing extravagant, just small, delicate ones that caught the breeze and made music out of silence. I told myself each sound was a message. A hello. A reminder. Maybe it was just sentiment, but I'd learned not to question the things that kept my heart beating. Ray would have called me a sap and then brought home 3 more chimes just to make fun of me. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for my phone to text him about something stupid, like the new neighbor who insisted on mowing his lawn at 7 a.m. on Sundays, or the fact that Toby now snored louder than any dog had the right to. The instinct never fully faded. And maybe it wasn't supposed to. Maybe some connections are so embedded in your DNA that even death can't sever them. I started talking to him aloud again. Not like a prayer. Not like a ghost. Just a conversation. A continuation. A ritual. "Missed you today, man. You would have hated this meal. The world's still a mess, but I'm hanging on." One afternoon, I got a letter from Ray's sister. I didn't even know he had one. She wrote that she'd found out about the book, the dedication, the tree, everything. Said she and Ray hadn't spoken in years. Too much baggage. Too much pride. But reading my words, she said, helped her understand the man he became in his final years. She thanked me for loving him the way he needed to be loved. Her handwriting shook, but her words were solid. He always needed someone to believe he was more than the worst thing that ever happened to him. You gave him that. I cried when I read that. Not out of sadness, but out of honor. I thought about legacy again, his and mine. How it wasn't measured in plaques or followers or awards. It was measured in moments. In choices. In presence. I started mentoring young men through a local program, guys who'd come out of rehab or who'd lost someone or who just never had a steady hand to guide them. I told them stories. Shared scars. Let them sit with their anger, their grief, their guilt without flinching. I didn't have all the answers. But I had experience. I had Ray's voice in my head reminding me that sometimes just being there is enough. And I told every single one of them, eventually, you don't have to do this alone. Find your person. Be someone's person. That's how we get through this. I started keeping a journal again too. Not for publication. Just for me. Pages filled with memories, reflections, letters to Ray. One entry read, "Today I didn't think of you until after dinner." That scared me. And then I realized it didn't mean I'd forgotten. It meant I'd learned how to carry you differently. Grief is like that. It never leaves. But it gets quieter. Softer. It stops screaming and starts humming low, steady, always there. And in that hum, there's strength. In that hum, there's life. And in every note of it, there's Ray. The first spring without Ray in the world hit harder than I expected. Not because I thought the grief had disappeared, no, I knew better than that, but because I realized how much of the world I now saw through him. Every blooming tree, every flash of green pushing up through the soil, every rusted pickup rolling down Main Street, it all felt like it carried traces of his presence. That was the thing about deep friendship, it didn't end when the body did. It echoed. It rewrote your instincts. It became part of the lens through which you viewed everything else. Ray had become that for me. A filter, a compass, a voice embedded somewhere between my ribs and my spine, always pointing me home. One afternoon, I returned to the lake where we'd first reconnected over a lost dog and a shared silence. The water looked the same. Still. Reflective. Unforgiving. I brought a 6-pack and 2 chairs. Set them up side by side. I cracked a beer, placed one on the ground next to the empty seat, and just sat. I didn't cry. Didn't speak. I let the wind do the talking. I let the birds and the rustling trees and the creak of my chair hold the weight of it. It wasn't about remembering anymore. It was about being with him even in his absence. That's what true connection does. It finds ways to stay even when it's been ripped from your hands. I thought a lot that day about all the versions of myself I'd been. The man who broke, who shut the world out. The man who found something solid to hold onto in the middle of the wreckage. The man who stood back up, shakily, stubbornly. I thought about who I'd be if Ray hadn't shown up that day. And the answer terrified me. Not because I feared death, but because I now knew the life I almost missed. And it was beautiful. Not flashy or perfect. Not storybook, but real. Full of mess and quiet and resilience. Full of long nights and hard truths and the kind of love that never asks you to be okay, only to keep going. That was Ray's gift to me. Not saving me. Not fixing me. But walking beside me until I could find my way back to myself. Later that night, back at home, I went into his old RV. I hadn't touched it in months. Still smelled like pine and old coffee. Dust danced in the sunlight that poured through the blinds. I sat on the bench seat where he used to read the paper and stared at the worn indent he'd left. And I smiled. Because that space, that was what he left behind. Not just memories, not just lessons. But spaces. Places in the world that were shaped by his presence. Places I could step into and still feel him. Before I left, I took a small photo of us from the fridge, one where we're both flipping off the camera, laughing like idiots. I placed it on the RV dashboard, right where he used to keep a bobblehead of Clint Eastwood. There I said quietly, "Now you're the one driving." It felt fitting, because even now he was still leading me, still pushing me to write, to show up, to love hard and stay longer and never underestimate the power of simply being there. And when I stepped outside, when the wind caught my jacket and the sun dipped low across the backyard, I knew something deep in my chest. Ray hadn't just helped me survive the worst day of my life. He had helped me build a new one. One worth living. One worth sharing. One filled with the kind of love that stays long after the footsteps fade. In time, people started referring to me not as the man who lost his family, but as the man who found something after. It was subtle at first, how they introduced me at events, how articles were written, how strangers addressed me in letters. They'd say things like, "Your story gives me hope," or "You remind me that the end isn't always the end." And while part of me still flinched at being labeled an inspiration as if surviving grief were some kind of accomplishment, I also knew what they meant. They weren't celebrating my pain. They were celebrating the bridge I had built out of it. And Ray had been the first plank in that bridge. I started traveling more, not to escape, but to expand. To visit the places Ray had once told me about. Old biker towns, desert roads, lakes tucked behind forgotten woods. I brought his photo with me everywhere I went. Set it on nightstands, dashboards, the bar next to my beer. Sometimes I'd talk to him, sometimes I'd just listen. There were places I know he would have loved, places I wanted to show him so badly it made my chest ache. But in some way, I felt like he was already there. Maybe not watching, but woven in. Into the earth. The air. Me. One evening, deep in the Rockies, I found a quiet cabin to rent. It had no Wi-Fi, no television, no distractions. Just a fireplace, a desk, and a window overlooking miles of pines. I stayed for a week. Wrote every day. Not a book. Not a blog. Just for me. Letters to Ray. Stories he'd never get to hear. Jokes I knew would have made him roll his eyes. And memories, so many memories. I wrote about the time he tried to teach me how to fish and I caught a tire instead. About the Christmas we didn't decorate a tree but strung beer cans on the porch instead. About the way he'd always leave one fry in the bottom of the bag and call it the survivor. Dumb stuff. Real stuff. Our stuff. When the week ended, I bundled the pages into a leather binder and left it on the cabin's bookshelf, tucked between two dusty novels. I didn't sign it. Didn't leave a name. Just scrawled one line on the cover: "If you've ever felt alone, read this." And no, someone stayed. I don't know if anyone will ever find it. But that wasn't the point. The point was letting it exist. Letting Ray's spirit echo in a stranger's moment of need. The way he'd once echoed in mine. Back home, I picked up a new habit: Sunday dinners. Every week, I invited someone new. A neighbor. A kid from the mentorship program. A friend of a friend going through something. It wasn't a charity. It was a tradition. Something Ray and I had always wanted to do but never quite got around to. I cooked the meals he liked. Played his old records. Told his stories, not as eulogies, but as introductions. This was Ray, I'd say. And if he were here, he'd be teasing the hell out of you right now. And through those meals, something strange happened. My home became his. Not just in photos or belongings, but in atmosphere. In the comfort people felt the moment they stepped through the door. In the way laughter bounced off the walls and no one ever felt the need to apologize for crying. It became a sanctuary, not just for me, but for anyone who needed to be reminded that love, real love, doesn't vanish. It roots. It holds. It grows. And in those moments, between the plates and the stories, the tears and the toasts, I realized something I never thought I'd say again. I was happy. Not in spite of the loss, but because I had learned how to carry it. Because Ray had taught me how. Now, years later, I sit at the same kitchen table where Ray once teased me for buying the wrong kind of coffee filters, the morning sun casting long stripes across the floor, and I finally understand the full shape of what he left behind. Not just memories, not just laughter and stories and sarcastic remarks that still play in my head like a soundtrack. What Ray left me was something far rarer. Something I had never known I could possess again after that crash tore my world in half. He gave me belonging, a place not defined by blood or legacy, but by choice, by the simple, sacred act of showing up. Sometimes I wonder what he'd say if he saw all this now. The book royalties I donated to grief support centers. The tiny writing cabin I built in the backyard with a quote of his etched above the door. The friendships I've formed with men who were once broken in the same quiet way I had been. The life that bloomed, slow but stubborn, out of the ashes. I think about that more than I admit. But I like to believe he'd nod, grunt something like, "Not bad for a guy who used to cry into cereal," and then change the subject to baseball stats or whatever new dog food Toby had decided he hated. The grief doesn't go away. Let's stop pretending that's how it works. Some nights, when the house is too still, I still feel it rise. Like smoke from a fire I thought I'd already put out. But now I don't fight it. I make room for it. Pour it a drink. I let it sit with me like an old friend. And in its shadow there's always Ray. Always the echo of his voice saying, "You've made it farther than you thought you would. Don't stop now." Because life isn't about erasing pain. It's about learning to live alongside it. To carry it with grace, to keep building when everything around you has crumbled, to love again, not because you've forgotten what you lost, but because you've remembered how good it felt to care that deeply. Ray didn't come into my life with fireworks or fanfare. He came in through a knock at the door and a leash in his hand. Quiet, unassuming, steady. And in doing so, he became the most important chapter of my story. Not the end, not the climax, but the turning point, the place where it all began again. And as I write this now, with Toby snoring by my feet and the wind chimes singing in the backyard, I know without question that I was never truly alone. Even in the darkest moments, even when I thought I had nothing left to live for, someone, was on their way to meet me. He didn't save me, he stayed with me, and in that staying, he gave me the strength to save myself. So wherever you are, Ray, this life, this joy, this second chance, it's yours as much as it's mine. Thank you for everything, and I'll see you again someday. But not yet, not yet.